Hello, this is Russell Moore, and you're listening to The Russell Moore Show, brought to you by Christianity Today. Every week, we explore here conversations and questions from a Christian perspective to help you sort out how to live as a follower of Jesus in confusing times. And this week, we have a conversation to seek to do just that.
All right. Well, it's really fun because this episode of The Russell Moore Show, Russell and I have kind of switched spots, and I'm Ashley Hales, the producer of The Russell Moore Show, and we are going to talk about Russell's reading habits as well as the best books of 2022. Russell, you had so many beautiful books that you wrote about in your last newsletter. And folks, if you don't have access to that newsletter, go ahead and sign up, russellmoore.com/subscribe. And you've gotten a lot of fan mail and a lot of questions about those best books and podcasts of 2022. So I'm excited to dive into the topic of reading.
Well,
so
I am too.
Yes. So we've had a lot of questions in your questions at russellmoore.com about your reading practices, including the question about, do you ever sleep? Because people see your desert island playlists and your reading lists, and they change every time you send out a newsletter. So the question is, what does your reading habits look like that also allow you to sleep?
Well, I mean, I think what some people think is that what I'm reading or what I'm listening to is a checklist, meaning, okay, these are all the things that I have completed reading this week, and that's not the way I read. So it tells you what I'm reading at the moment. And there are a lot of times when if I'm not clicking with a book, I don't continue to read it, and I don't think you should. But I mean, I read quickly, which is not, there's nothing good or bad about that. I mean, there's some benefits and some drawbacks, but I just happen to read quickly.
Yeah.
And in terms of listening to things, I do a lot of driving, a lot of being on planes, and so I'll listen to things going through airports and read things on planes. So it works out that way.
Right. Let's think about, just tell us a little bit about what does your reading habits look like in terms of a day. So for instance, I'll spend my kind of early morning hours doing the hard sorts of reading because that's when I'm freshest. So things like commentaries or history or cultural analysis, I need my brain to be working. But at the evening time, at bedtime, I'm always going to bed with a novel. So what does your kind of reading practices look like throughout the day?
I really don't have a disciplined set of reading practices. I read what I want to when I want to.
I love it. Just follow the desire.
Yeah. I mean, there are times when I am reading something because I have to get it read for maybe an interview, or I'm teaching something, or I have to endorse a book and blurb it. I'll give myself sort of time frames for that. But generally, I just read what I want to when I want to. And if it does divide itself up into certain kinds of things at certain kinds of times, it's subconscious.
Right,
So
right.
I don't recognize it or see it.
Oh, I love it. It's good to hear because I think, you look at some of the books you've read and they're all these university presses, and it can feel like, oh, Russell Moore's reading is so like above and beyond the average person. Maybe that's what folks are thinking about. But I think it's just encouraging to hear you say, hey, there are certain things that call your attention, whether it's a topic, and there's certain things that are part of the requirement of your work. And that's like all of us.
And there are some things that I read, and what I recognize about it is this is not a bad book, but it's not for me. And so there are some things that I think I can see how somebody who would be really energized by whatever it is. I mean, for instance, on the list of the top 12 books, I included a book that I never would have picked up except for this personal connection. It's a book
Right.
by a
Right.
pediatric neurosurgeon. I'm usually not interested in neurosurgery, or
Yeah.
I know nothing about it. I'm not really interested in it. But because I had been, when I started off as an intern in Congress for Congressman Gene Taylor back when
Mhm.
I was 18, one of
Wow.
my
Yeah.
fellow interns, Melissa, married the author of this book. And so I knew about it, picked
Yeah.
it up, and
Yeah.
as I was reading it, I thought, I'm so glad I read this because
Mm,
it's not
mm,
something I would have just
mm.
passed over it if I
Yeah.
had seen
Yeah.
it in the Amazon recommendations or
For
on the shelf
sure.
of a bookstore.
You know what's interesting? I've thought about this as a parent too. This idea of like promiscuous reading. That this
Yeah.
wide range of reading, and even for children, they'll often say that when you don't have categories for understanding something, it doesn't mean that you should push your kids into reading something that's inappropriate by any ways, but
Yeah.
that there's certain things that allow us then to engage with material that feels foreign and then to be welcomed into it. Um,
Yeah.
how have you found yourself as you have either read books moving along that sort of spectrum? In other words, how have you been welcomed into a wider range of reading maybe than you would have originally considered? Is it like,
Well,
reading the bibliographies or, the personal recommendations? What's helped open up your own reading life?
I don't know.
That's okay. That's okay.
That's one of the things I don't know. What I would say is, I think what was really helpful for me was
Mm-hmm.
that I didn't have parents who were
Mm-hmm.
telling me what I should read.
Mm-hmm.
So I was reading what I wanted to, and I found that I didn't do well with assigned reading.
Mm-hmm.
So I might very well read King Lear,
Right.
but not if it was not if we were
Required.
doing a class on King Lear. And so
Yeah.
that probably says
Hmm.
some bad things about me, but that's the case. It was
Right.
and it always has been
Mm.
the case. It's just
Mm-hmm.
really, I have to kind of have a connection with something that I'm reading,
Yeah.
and it has to be natural and organic.
Yeah. No, me too. I think that
And
that
that's
might.
one reason
Yeah.
why I really miss um, physical bookstores
Mm-hmm.
being as
Yeah.
prevalent as they
Mm-hmm.
once were, because that's what they're designed to do.
Mm-hmm.
Is to sort of introduce you to those books that you just kind of happen upon.
Right. Yeah. The
And so
serendipity of that moment. Yeah.
it really is, yeah. And my wife and kids and I were driving home to my hometown, Biloxi, Mississippi, last week. And we always take an extra couple hours, I think, to the trip to go through Oxford, Mississippi,
Mm-hmm.
because one of my favorite bookstores, Square
Yeah.
Books, is there.
Yeah.
And inevitably you're going to come across things that you say, "Oh, I didn't even know
Right.
this
Yeah.
was out, or that this
Right.
existed."
Yes.
So I think we've lost
Yeah.
something with losing that. We've gained a lot
Yep.
with having algorithms to
Mm-hmm.
help us, but we've lost a lot too.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's exactly right. What it sounds like you have a real rich history with your childhood reading experiences. I know for me, that became such a core part of who I am is as a reader, right? In those early
Hmm.
childhood years. And the imaginative worlds that they opened up to me. Have you
Hmm.
found that to be the case for you, that childhood love of reading, maybe even slightly, disruptive or transgressive versions of reading has really opened up something for you in your adult life or in your work?
Oh, yes. I mean, I started out by reading comic books. And
Yeah.
again, nothing transgressive
Right.
there,
Yeah.
in the sense that my parents didn't not only did they not say you need to read this,
Right.
but they also didn't discourage me or kind of redirect me away
Mm-hmm.
from anything. So they were perfectly happy for me to be
Right.
reading X-Men comic books,
Yep.
and that actually, I think
Mm-hmm.
most people that I know who really have a wide sort of spectrum of
Mm-hmm.
reading and are
Mm-hmm.
interested in many things, that's how it started.
Yeah.
It's almost always the case,
Yeah.
and I think it's a way to be introduced to all sorts of concepts. I mean,
Right.
there are ways in which later reading other things, I could see the same
Mm.
mythologies and the same
Yeah.
structures that I could find there.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember very early on, because I was so Bible taught and
Right.
so anchored in the Bible, I could see the biblical allusions
Right. Right.
that are taking place
Right.
with Superman or
Right.
somebody else.
Yeah.
And so I think that a lot of people I've found
Mm-hmm.
that's the common starting point.
Mm-hmm. And it kind of primes the pump for you then to be able to more imaginatively engage with people too, right? It grows that empathy muscle as well.
I think so. I don't know that it creates empathy. I know there are some
No.
people who would say that reading creates a sense of empathy or deepens empathy. I'm not sure that that's the case, but it does give an expression of
Mm-hmm.
a definition to empathy. So through reading, I can imagine situations that I ordinarily would never encounter. I've
Right.
never been addicted, but I can
Right.
understand what it's like to be an addict. Not wholly, but you can inhabit a little bit of that
Yeah.
life in order to see
Mm-hmm.
it.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way, I mean, the music that I listen to, I'm an old school country music
Mm-hmm.
guy, and many, if not most, of the songs that are on my playlist are things that I have never personally related to.
Mm-hmm.
George Jones singing about a marriage breaking up or about coming home drunk. I mean, it's just never
Right.
happened with me, but I
Yeah.
can imagine what it would be like for
Mm.
him.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and it communicates that to me. So it's a way of people telling their stories and a way of
Right.
hearing those stories in a safer,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I would say safer, in a more candid way.
Right.
Because what happens is often if you sit down and you say to someone, tell me your story, unless you have an already really personal sort of connection
Mm-hmm.
with that person, everything's going to be kind of edited.
Right.
People are going to want to avoid judgment. And so there are things they're not going to say and things they are. But through art, whether it's through books or music or something else, you get a more authentic look sometimes
Right.
where people aren't
Mm-hmm.
protecting themselves or
Right.
editing things out. And I
Right.
find that helpful.
Right. I mean, because the best fiction is obviously not going to be like heavily narrated and, telling us how to think, right? It's pushing you as a reader into experiencing that narrative. Well,
Yeah,
yeah,
the fiction that doesn't do that, the fiction that does want to come in,
right.
Eudora Welty talked about this in terms of the novelist crusading.
Yeah, right.
And I even noticed this as a kid in a lot of Christian
Yeah, yeah,
books and a
yeah,
lot of
yeah,
Christian fiction. You could tell it was, okay, we're trying to tell you that you
right.
ought to uh, get saved
Right,
or whatever
right.
it
Yeah,
is, and that doesn't tell the story.
right. Yeah. No. And I think, the best stories are such a mix of different things, right? Different genres, different emotions, different feelings. Um, And yeah, even the best Christian novelists, whether it's someone like Tolkien or Lewis or whomever, they're really grappling with the darkness too, not just here's what you need
Oh
to
yeah,
think about a particular thing. And part of that is the journey of the reader. I love that.
yeah.
Well, we have so many questions about your book club. I think it's come up in a few of our conversations recently, as you've just been able to reference how, particularly during the pandemic, that the book club that you're a part of has been really influential. So tell us a little bit about how that came to be and how you've chosen some of those books. It might help some of our listeners think about how they might start their own book club as well.
Well, I'm in two book clubs. So one that's ongoing and one that kind of comes and goes. And we met during the pandemic because we could meet outside and sit far away from each other. And we were reading through T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets at the time. All of us love that, and so we had that time together during the pandemic. But the ongoing book club we have over Zoom because we're scattered all over the place, and then we'll get together physically every once in a while when we can. But it was really helpful and important for me because it's almost a way to trick yourself into fellowship. So I'm not the kind of person who likes to, church small groups, I just find unbearable. Because it's sort of the point is, okay, here you are, commune.
Right. Ready, go.
Which is, which is similar to me as somebody who's had insomnia troubles all my life, to someone saying, okay, you need to go to sleep. You have to get up in the morning, go to sleep. I can't do that. And so book club would be a way for all of us to be doing the same thing together, reading a particular book. But really, it's really similar to the most successful men's Bible studies and small groups I ever knew in my church growing up were always related to disaster relief or helping somebody clean up their yard after a hurricane or something like that, where there was an activity that you were all engaged in, and you find fellowship in that. And so that's really what, for us, the book club is mostly about praying for each other and supporting each other and encouraging each other. I mean, every day we have prayer requests going around. Not all of us are Christians in the book club, but a lot of us are. And so it was a way for me to regularly have fellowship, especially during the pandemic, in ways that weren't related to my job. So I was having a lot of meetings, but this is different.
Right. Yeah. How many people are in it? And tell us a little bit about who started it. Was it your start?
No, I didn't. I didn't start it. Pete Weiner, who's part of the book club, he started it several years ago. I think there are 12 or 13 of us in it. We're not all always there, but usually there's 10 of us at any given time. Somewhere around in there.
Right. And how do you pick your book club selections?
Usually we shift it around. Someone will pick a book, and then that person will either introduce the book. Here's why I wanted to do that. Sometimes we'll ask the author of the book to join us. And we've done that many times. And there was even one instance where we asked an author of a book to join us, and he just connected so much with us that he became part of the book club. So that has happened before too.
That's fantastic. I've read an article recently that the author was speaking about different types of reading. And I'd love to hear the ways in which this either informs your own book choices or even thinking about it in terms of your book club. But she talked about there's 3 different types of kind of reading, she says, for leaders particularly. There's the kind of comfort us reading, the grow us sort of reading, and the disrupt us sort of reading. So, even as you look at your list of best 12 books, how would you find that those three categories fitting in with your reading or the books that you gravitate towards as a club?
I I I think that all three of those categories would be there, but I'm not consciously picking
Right,
things
right.
because of their categories. And again, it's almost as though, um, I mean, uh, Wendell Berry,
Mm.
one time I was out at his place and kind of fanboying a little bit. It was
It
just
would be
sort of,
hard not to.
yeah, and I was saying, this book this particular book that you wrote, this particular place of it changed my life.
Mm,
And what he said was, and I think about it all the time,
mm,
isn't it funny how we meet just the right person at just the right time, and we read just the right book at just the right
mm,
time?
mhm.
And I've found that that's
It
true, but I
is, it is.
often find that it's not. I'm not sort of consciously deciding that when I say I
Right.
just read what I want to. I do think that there's something in one's soul that can
Yeah.
kind of alert you.
Mhm.
You should read this,
Yeah.
but in ways that you
Oh,
don't
for
know.
sure. Yeah, I think I liked those sorts of categories as kind of a retrospective to go, oh, yeah, I do follow that. But
Yeah.
the idea of
Yeah.
systematizing my own reading by those categories would feel, like you said, quite claustrophobic. And then I
Yeah.
just go
And
read a novel for fun just because.
yeah. And there are someone texted me, political figure,
Hmm.
consultant, texted me the other day and said, he was asking me something about my hometown,
Yeah.
Biloxi. He said, I saw on Wikipedia that you're from there. And so I was answering some question and I said, why do you ask? And he said, well, I'm kind of embarrassed to admit it.
Uh-huh.
But I'm reading John Grisham's
Right. Yeah.
Boys
Boys
from
of Bill.
Biloxi.
Yeah.
And I said, well, I am too, but why are you embarrassed? He said, oh, I'm so relieved that there are that you
Huh.
read lowbrow stuff. And
Yeah.
I'm like, I
I
don't
think
put things
yeah.
into those
Yeah.
categories
Right.
at all.
Right. That's
And
a
so
lot of pressure
read.
to
It
only
is.
read
It
highbrow.
is. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Or I mean, or that you only read lowbrow or
Right,
middlebrow,
right,
whatever it
right,
is.
right. Yeah.
Read what you want,
Yeah. Right.
and let what you want to read
Mm,
kind of guide you into better and better things,
right.
which is usually what happens. Is
Right.
you start to read, and that it just directs you in different ways. But
Right.
don't be
Don't
embarrassed
judge.
by
Yeah.
whatever it is
Don't
you
judge
like.
your reading. I like that. You
No.
know, the Christianity Today book awards just came out, which is really
Hmm.
always exciting. I always wait for those every year to read those.
Yeah.
So, listeners, if you need a book suggestion, of course, go over to Christianity Today and find out some of those book awards. I've read a few of those, so it was really fun to see. My friend Kelly Kapic just won for the Best Popular Theology Award, and there's
Hmm.
lots of good books to get in there. But as we've been thinking about the value of reading and reading practices, there are those lists, right? Like the CT Book Awards that really can help direct
Yeah.
our reading. For your list, particularly your 12 best of 2022, what were maybe some of the lessons when you actually put those together and you took your picture and you put it on Instagram, and you sent out that newsletter, as you culled those 12 books, maybe just realizing, hey, I'm still thinking about these. Was there
Hmm.
one maybe that might rise to the top that felt like this is something that's really special that I want to hold on to, or I'd love to give to a multitude of pastors or leaders that I know, that feels like something encouraging?
I think that uh, all of them spoke uniquely to me in some way or the other, and
Yeah.
all of them would be things that I would give to people, but I would give to different
Different
people.
people. Yeah.
So, I mean, if somebody, for instance, is asking about wanting to think about imagination and how imagination ought to shape and form how to read the Bible and how to think through things, then I'll take the little Malcolm Guite book and give it to them and say, read this. It's less than 80 pages, and it just speaks beautifully to that. Or I have the Clarence Jordan book that Plow Publishing put out. I recommended and gave to somebody who, like too many people right now, has lost his church family over division. And I said, just read Clarence Jordan's experience as somebody who was pro civil rights, pro racial justice, white Southern Baptist pastor in the Jim Crow era who lost his church, and the affection that you can tell you, the affection he has for even that church that rejected him. I gave it to that person and said, read this and you might identify with some of the things that he's saying. So it just would depend on what situation somebody's in.
Right.
Or if I've recommended something before that somebody likes, and I know that they like it, then that'll help me to say, oh, you ought to check this out. You might like it too.
Yeah. You're helping some of that bookstore serendipity, right, that we've lost.
Yeah.
I think that's great.
And it doesn't offend me if if I've recommended a book to somebody and they don't like it. That happens to me all the time. And there was a book that I did read out of obligation this year. And I was really glad I did. And a lot of people have asked, why didn't you include Everything Sad is Untrue novel in the list of the best books of 2022? And it's because it was certainly one of the best I read in 2022, but it was a 2021 book.
Oh, there you go.
And the only way I knew about it was I was getting these constant texts from Beth Moore as she was making it through the book. And she said, this book is just unbelievable. You have to read it.
Right.
And again, kind of like the pediatric neurosurgery book, I looked at the description and thought, well, that's not really the sort of thing that interests me. But she finally said, you need to listen to your mother, because she has a joke that she's my mother. You need to listen to your mother and read this book. And so I did. I said, okay, I have to report back to her that I read it, and started reading it. And I thought, wow, this is unbelievable. And the more I went through it, it would just totally pivot on you in the middle of the book. And I found it better and better and better as it went.
I can't wait to read that. It's on my shelf. So yes. Oh, that's good. Well, as we think about books and we think about books to help us in leadership, particularly, you mentioned one of your favorite reads was Non-Verts, The Making of Ex-Christian America, which has also been on my to be read list. So I wanted to just pick your brain on it for a little bit. How is that an encouraging book, as we think about folks who have left their churches over the last 3 years? Barna reports up to a third of Christians are no longer attending church, and as we think about, I'm even reminded my husband preached this Advent season on Isaiah 40 and thinking about that Jesus in John 15 is talking about the pruning, right, of God's church. And that some, means that branches are cut off. Other times it's a pruning to create a healthier church. So given some of these contextual things, the sense of loss, whether chosen or not, that the Christian church in America particularly is experiencing, how does the book Non-Verts kind of interact with our current moment in time?
Yeah, well, I agree with that pruning is happening. I don't know that I would say that that's what's happening with this.
Right.
Because in some cases it is, but in a lot of cases what I see happening is closer to what's taking place in John 9 rather than John 15, in which the religious leaders are sort of pushing the blind man and his family outside of the community. And the whole point of it is They're the ones who are blind.
Right,
And I
right.
think that with a lot of situations where we're seeing people who start to conclude, well, the church is itself fraudulent
Right.
or not telling the truth, that often is what's happening.
Mhm.
When you asked if Nonverts is an encouraging book, I would say yes, but in the sense that it breaks through some gaslighting
Right.
and says, I'm really telling you the truth about the
Right.
way that I see this. We're looking at the data. We're not denying that.
Mhm.
And so it's encouraging in that sense, and it equips you to have to understand that you're not dealing with all the same thing.
Right.
Because I read the book because I read another book that the same author, Stephen Bullivant, had written a couple years ago called Mass Exodus.
Mm-hmm.
It was about the effect that the sexual abuse cover-ups,
Right.
particularly, had upon church attendance in Great Britain and
Mm-hmm.
Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
And so reading that, this is particularly directed toward United States of America. Right. But the main point is to come in and say, we use that category of the nuns, those who have no religious affiliation. That's not really the right category because you have some people who just aren't religious, have never really been religious. And then you have the people who previously were and have fallen away or have walked away or have been pushed away from the church. And he uses this really helpful analogy. He said it's the difference between saying, this is somebody that I'm not married to, one of the billions of people that I'm not married to, as opposed to this is an ex-spouse. Very different relationship with those two things.
That's helpful.
And the nonverts he's showing, it's not just that sometimes there's more of an intensity, and you can see that even with people who convert from one faith or one denomination to the other. I know in churches I've served, the people who were the most rigidly anti-Catholic were former Catholics. And my Catholic friends tell me the same thing is true in reverse. And so that there's the part of that is there, but it's also just the way that a person thinks is shaped and formed by that religious background, even if they now reject it. So it's really helpful to kind of look around sociologically and see what's happening.
Right. And give you some good terms to be able to at least be able to articulate what's going on in one's particular context based on some of that data.
Yeah.
That's
and
great.
He uses the category. I kind of laughed because I didn't expect this from this British writer to know Jeannie C. Riley's song Harper Valley PTA. But he did, and he calls it the Harper Valley effect, which, of course, in that song, you have a single mother who's being judged by the community at the PTA meeting. And she goes through and just starts saying all of the things that are going on with those people and how hypocritical it is. And he says there's a Harper Valley effect where when you put together dogmatic moralizing with moral chaos in the same person or group, that repels people more than anything. And I think that's obviously what we've been seeing in recent years.
Yeah, that's really good. Another book that I just wanted to spend a few minutes on is The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis. I'd love to think a bit about that book by Jason Baxter, because I think it really, what I appreciate about the ideas behind it, I haven't read it yet, so full disclosure, but is, that it's helping us to kind of reimagine again something more enchanted, if we're going to use something, that Charles Taylor would say. Jessica Hooten Wilson endorsed the book, and she talks about Lewis having a forgotten way of seeing. So I wonder if there's something in this book that you would be able to describe as what is that forgotten way of seeing that Lewis kind of helps us see again. And can we remember that again? That imaginative, enchanted world. that we do get in more of the medieval period.
What I liked about this book is there's a kind of dress-up medievalism that tends to romanticize the Middle Ages in the same way that other people romanticize other eras. And the book doesn't do that. What it's doing is coming in and saying, if you're going to understand Lewis, then you have to understand how he's being shaped and formed by specifically by medieval literature. He was a classics professor. He was teaching the great works of literature and was shaped and formed by them in all of these different ways, in ways that if you see it, you can see the influence of the ancient world. I mean, think of the professor in The Last Battle. This is all in Plato. You can see Plato all through Chronicles of Narnia and other places, but you also see Dante and you see these other influences. And what the book points out is a lot of times, and Charles Taylor, as you mentioned, points this out too, a lot of times the most, the deepest ways that we've secularized are things that we don't see at all because we just don't recognize the categories we're using, or more importantly, I think the metaphors that we're using. So if we go back to Wendell Berry, he had a book, Life is a Miracle, where he argues one of the biggest problems we have is the metaphor that we use of people as machines.
For sure.
So you might say, I want to find out what makes her tick, or he's really processing that. Those sorts of metaphors, they change the way that you see things because that's how we perceive things, is through metaphor. And so this book comes in and says that kind of quantified, mechanized sort of view of the universe, that's what is being challenged in Lewis's more medieval way of seeing things, in which the universe around us is alive in one very real sense. And so it makes it makes better sense of if one, for instance, looks at the space trilogy that Lewis is writing, and that view of, some people would say, well, it's not really up to date with a scientific understanding of the universe. Lewis knew that even then. That wasn't the point he was making. Or to say, well, I mean, I just don't know about all the talking animals in Chronicles of Narnia. He's doing something really specific with that. And a lot of that is influenced by the way he's seeing the world, and that's shaped by what he was reading.
Yeah. So is there something for us to glean from that book, or even as we think further past it, not just about Lewis and his fiction, but, is there a new way of seeing, or a different way of seeing, that we're invited into, do you think, through his works?
Yeah, I think that, the Baxter uses this analogy. I'm probably getting it wrong. But he talks about this analogy. We tend to think in terms of laws of gravity in really impersonal sorts of ways, where what Lewis is picking up from the medieval writers is a metaphor more of, rather than there's a law that causes the apple to fall to the ground when it falls from the tree, which of course is true. But there's a different metaphor of a kind of longing of the apple for the ground, which is also true in a different way. So I think the main thing is kind of noticing. I mean, I remember after Life is a Miracle, I just started noticing all the ways that I would slip into that sort of machine talk. And then that would change the way that I would see people. And sometimes, even with the way that we expect people to act rationally all the time, and to say, I don't understand why he's doing this, when we understand that we don't act by reason alone.
But we expect other people to, right?
And so if you just notice that, and you're saying you're not seeing those people as persons, you're seeing them as algorithms, and
Right.
that's just not a realistic view of the world.
Right. No, I think, yeah, that sounds like it might bring us at least closer to some version of civility and humility um, as we consider
Yeah.
people. That's great. Well, I'd love to just chat forever about books, but I wanted just to end on a little fun note for like a quick fire and answer round. Um, Before we get there, though, I would love to hear. There was a few questions in your email about, hey, you don't have any books by women. So I'm a woman.
Yeah.
I'm not offended. But I would love to hear, yeah, what would be your favorite book by a woman that you've read recently?
Oh, recently, I mean, Marilyn Robinson is a
Yeah.
huge influence on me, and her. It's not a book, but I think it's probably going to be one
Mm-hmm.
eventually. She has an article in the New York Review of Books
Mm-hmm.
this month called "A Theology of the Present Moment."
Ooh.
Um, and in some ways, actually, she's addressing what we were just talking about,
Mm.
where she's saying, for a long time, there was this idea of science and religion being at odds with one
Yeah.
another.
Yeah.
But now we're starting to realize
Mm-hmm.
the most scientifically minded people are knowing how much mystery there is to the
Yeah.
universe. And so
Mm-hmm.
she kind of teaches a very secular audience about
Mm-hmm.
some insights from Jonathan Edwards on continuous creation and those sorts of
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
Fantastic
Yes.
article, and I think it'll probably be a book.
Yes. Well, she does have a bit on that, I think, in her essay, her most recent essay collection as well. So that's something
Yeah.
people could pick up until that one gets turned around into a new book. Okay. So
Mhm.
quickly, what was the best book you read as a child, or best comic book, I suppose? The one that stuck with you.
Yeah, Chris Claremont's run on X-Men
Mm-hmm.
was really important to me. I mean, I read all kinds of comic books, but that was one that I would wait for every month because
Yeah.
I didn't know what was going to happen,
One of
and
those page
it stands
turners.
out.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
good. That's good.
And then, of course, Chronicles of Narnia
Yeah.
was really, really important
Mm-hmm.
for me.
Mm-hmm.
Tolkien too,
Yeah.
but especially Lion, the Witch, and the
Yeah.
Wardrobe just really changed the way I saw
Mm.
everything, and I
Wow.
think for the rest of my life.
Wow. What's the best book that stuck with you that you've read recently? Keeps coming up in
You know,
conversations, maybe.
yeah, I mean, I have had a lot of conversations about Tim Keller's book on forgiveness
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because a lot of people, when Tim and I did the podcast
Yep.
here
Yep.
on the show, a lot of people said, well, they went and picked up the book.
Yeah. Yeah.
And one person said to me, I felt really convicted and not at all judged,
That's
which I
beautiful.
thought was a
Yeah.
really successful a way of judging the success of the book.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that was the goal. And so I've had a lot of kind of follow-up
Mm-hmm.
conversations about that book because
Mm-hmm.
we all have the need to be forgiven
Yes.
and to forgive, and we all find it hard to do both.
Yes. And it's so practical too, that book, with
Yeah.
really helpful ways forward about what that looks like and how to do it.
Yeah.
Best
Absolutely.
best book of poetry.
I don't know what I would say is the best book of
For you.
poetry writ large.
Right.
But I would say that Malcolm Guite, who I
Yeah.
referenced, his poetry in recent years has been important for me, especially one called "The Christian's Plummet,"
Uh-huh.
that's about the sign of Jonah. Really, really important for me. There's a Wendell Berry poem
Mm-hmm.
that became really important to me every day at a particular time called
Hmm.
"Don't Be Ashamed."
Hmm.
And that one was really important to me. But somebody whose poetry I go to a lot, all the time, is a poet by the name of David White,
Mm-hmm.
who's actually a former marine biologist, which you
Mm-hmm.
don't ordinarily see a
Yeah.
lot of marine biologist poets. But his work is just really, it really speaks to me.
Wow, that's great. And And Malcolm Gate's going to be on the podcast in about a month's time. So we'll look forward to
I'm looking forward to
that dialogue as well. What is one of the best books that you've enjoyed reading with your wife or with your children or all together? Family read aloud.
One of the things that we have when the kids were little that we read so often that it still just sort of peppers conversation is Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are. Just because, especially, I mean, I don't have any daughters, but I have 5 sons. So I don't know if there's anything particularly gendered about this, but I do know that little boys love that book. And I've got all kinds of theories as to why that is. But that book was just read so often that we have it memorized. And it still comes up even though they're older.
Yes. Do you have a favorite Christmas book? Like, bring out and read it every Christmas?
No. I don't think I do.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, I don't think I do. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you can all send your suggestions for next year for Russell's Christmas reading list. What book are you most excited to dig into over the holidays? Maybe it's a piece of comfort reading or something you've been putting off and it can't wait to open up.
Well, I just started that Grisham Boys from Biloxi book, which I'm maybe 10% to 15% into, but a lot of the beginning is sort of historical foundations of my hometown. So I'm enjoying that.
That's good.
And I don't normally, I'm not normally a John Grisham genre. The genre that he does just is not normally anything that I read, but because he's coming at it from that vantage point, that means I have to.
Yes.
And a lot of times when I read books that are set in my hometown, there are times when I'm infuriated because I'm like, this is somebody who doesn't understand the Mississippi Gulf Coast, has no business writing about it. But there are other times, this is somebody who actually is paying attention and knows what's going on.
Yes. Well, I have the Louise Penny newest novel waiting for me for next week. So she's a Canadian mystery writer, and so that feels like a fun comfort read for me.
What's the name of that?
It's A World of Curiosities. It's the 18th book in the series. So, yes, Inspector Gamache. Okay. They've now made a Netflix special from it, but he's one of these strong-jawed, thoughtful, poetry-reading homicide detectives. So it's a lovely combination.
Yeah.
Yes.
You know what, in that genre that I really, normally I can't listen to audiobooks unless they're biographies because my attention goes in and out, and I have to have something where you don't have to follow something in order to come back into it. But the exception to that was, I can't even remember the author, but there was this trilogy about a detective. The Earth is about to be destroyed by an asteroid. The Last Policeman. Okay. And he's a police detective who has to solve a murder, knowing that the Earth is going to be destroyed in a couple months' time. And it was really fun to listen to by audiobook.
Yeah, that's great. There are a few good audiobooks for sure, but I share your hesitancy for sure. Well, thank you, Russell. It's been so fun to kind of dive into that newsletter. You can get Russell's newsletter at russellmoore.com/subscribe. But we appreciate all of your good reading and directing us to so many good books that will really, I hope, help us open up towards one another, right, as we move about into a new year.
And I would just say to listeners, if you find something you're reading that you think I'd like, send along the recommendation. A lot of times I find things that way.
Perfect.
Thanks for listening. Links are always in the show notes for resources mentioned in this episode, including a link about how you can have a trial membership to Christianity Today. Be sure to subscribe to the program, send an episode along to a friend who might benefit from it, and leave us a review when you can. It helps other people to find the show wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Russell Moore, and this is The Russell Moore Show from Christianity Today.
The Russell Moore Show is a production of Christianity Today. Executive producers are Erik, Petrik, Russell Moore, and Mike Cosper. Hosted by Russell Moore, produced by Ashley Hales, associate producers Abby Perry and Azare Phelps, CT administration provided by Christine Kolb, social media by Kate Lucky, director of operations for CT Media is Matt Stevens, production assistance provided by Core Media, audio engineer is Kevin Duthu, coordinator is Beth Grabencourt, video producer is John Rowland. The theme song for The Russell Moore Show is Dusty Delta Day by Lennon Hutton.